There is a moment in every celebrity's public life when the careful architecture they have built around themselves, the polished interviews, the rehearsed answers, the perfectly managed image, meets something it cannot absorb. A question too precise. A silence too long. A camera that keeps running when the room expects it to stop. Those moments are rare. But when they happen on live television, with no editor standing between the audience and the truth, they become something else entirely. They become part of the record. This is the story of one of those moments. The year was 2014. Lupita Nyong'o was, by almost any measure, the most talked about new face in Hollywood. She had just delivered a performance in 12 Years a Slave that critics were calling once in a generation. The awards circuit was treating her not as a contender but as a certainty. She was graceful, intelligent, and extraordinarily composed. Every interview she gave seemed to confirm what audiences already suspected, that here was someone who had arrived not just with talent, but with intention. She knew how to hold a room. She knew how to answer a question without fully answering it. She had, in the span of a single awards season, become one of the most admired public figures in the entertainment industry. And then she sat down across from Ellen DeGeneres. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome. Subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. We cover the moments that live television was never supposed to preserve, but did anyway. And this one belongs at the top of that list. Ellen DeGeneres was, at that point in 2014, the undisputed anchor of daytime television. The Ellen DeGeneres show had been on the air for over a decade. It had become the destination for celebrities who wanted what the industry calls a soft landing, a place to laugh, to dance, to promote their projects without friction. Ellen's brand was warmth. Her audience loved her because she made her guests feel at ease. She was not Barbara Walters. She was not a journalist trained to find the crack in a polished surface. She was, by every public measure, the safest couch in show business. Which is precisely what made what happened next so striking. When Lupita Nyong'o walked onto that stage, she was carrying the weight of an entire industry that had decided she was its moment of self-congratulation. Hollywood was celebrating itself through her success, and she was navigating that dynamic with a precision that impressed even the most cynical observers. She had learned, in a very short time, exactly how much of herself to offer in a public setting. She was present without being exposed. She was warm without being vulnerable. It was a performance in its own right, the performance of someone who had studied the unwritten rules of celebrity and mastered them. Ellen had a different energy that afternoon. Not malicious, not a calculated ambush. But Ellen had a habit, one her longtime viewers knew well, of pressing past the prepared answer into something less rehearsed. She did it gently. She did it with a smile. She did it in a way that made it difficult to object to in the moment without appearing defensive or guarded. That was the particular skill of it. The question always arrived wrapped in something that looked like friendliness. And on this specific afternoon, she deployed that habit at the exact wrong moment for the woman sitting across from her. The studio audience laughed at first, as studio audiences tend to do. They are conditioned by the warm-up act, by the lighting, by the music, to receive everything that happens in that room as entertainment. But even they went quiet. Not immediately. Gradually. The way a room goes quiet when it realizes that what it is watching is no longer part of the program. No longer scripted. No longer safe. We are going to walk through exactly what happened, the build-up, the question, the reaction, and what it meant. Because understanding this moment requires understanding both women, who they were when they walked into that studio, what they had each built, and why a single live exchange could ripple outward the way this one did. Lupita Nyong'o had spent months answering questions with extraordinary grace. She had given hundreds of interviews across the awards circuit and never once appeared rattled. She was known for that composure. It was part of her public identity. And yet the thing about composure, the thing that nobody talks about, is that it requires constant maintenance. It is not a fixed state. It is a discipline. And disciplines, under the right kind of pressure, can slip. Even briefly. Even in ways so small that a less attentive camera might miss them entirely. The camera in that studio missed nothing. There are interviews you watch and forget by the time the credits roll. There are interviews you remember vaguely as pleasant or slightly awkward. And then there are the ones that stay with you. The ones where you can recall the exact expression on a face at the precise moment the room shifted. This was one of those. And the reason it still matters, more than a decade later, is not because it was a scandal, and not because it ended careers. It matters because for one unedited, unscripted minute on live television, something genuine broke through. Something that no publicist had approved and no green room preparation had anticipated. What exactly was asked? What exactly was said? And what happened in the seconds that followed? That is what we are here to examine. And it starts not in that studio, but months earlier, with a woman who was becoming famous faster than anyone around her had prepared her to be. To understand the weight of that afternoon's conversation, you have to understand what Lupita Nyong'o had survived to get to that couch. She was born in Mexico City in 1983 to Kenyan parents. Her father, Peter Enyang Nyong'o, was a prominent academic and political figure who would later serve as governor of Kisumu County in Kenya. The family returned to Nairobi when Lupita was still a young child, and she grew up there in a household where education, public service, and intellectual rigor were not optional values. They were the foundation of everything. That upbringing shaped her in ways that would later set her apart entirely from the Hollywood system she entered as an adult. She did not arrive in the entertainment industry through the usual doors. There was no talent scout, no viral moment, no lucky break handed to her by someone with connections. She studied at Hampshire College in Massachusetts, then pursued a graduate degree in acting at the Yale School of Drama. Yale, one of the most demanding and selective acting programs in the world. She trained for years before she was ever in front of a camera in any significant way. And when she finally was, the role she was given was not a comfortable introduction to stardom. In 12 Years a Slave, directed by Steve McQueen, Lupita played Patsy, an enslaved woman subjected to relentless brutality, a character whose suffering is so precisely rendered on screen that audiences found it almost unbearable to watch. It was not a glamorous debut. It was a devastating one. And the performance she delivered was so emotionally exact, so technically controlled while simultaneously appearing completely unguarded, that it forced the industry to pay attention in a way it rarely does for a first significant role. Critics were not just impressed. They were shaken. The awards season that followed was unlike anything a debut actress had experienced in recent memory. She won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. She won the Screen Actors Guild Award, the BAFTA, the Critics' Choice. She stood at podium after podium through the winter and early spring of 2014 and delivered acceptance speeches that people talked about for days afterward, not because they were flashy or self-promotional, but because they were considered, precise, and deeply felt. She spoke about beauty, about identity, about what it meant to grow up in a world that told certain people their faces did not belong on screens like the ones she was now standing in front of. Those speeches made her something beyond an actress who had given a remarkable performance. They made her a figure, a cultural presence, and with that came a level of public scrutiny that operates by its own logic, indifferent to what a person has actually earned or what they actually want to reveal about themselves. By the time the awards season wound down and the promotional circuit for the film had run its course, Lupita Nyong'o had given more interviews than most people give in an entire career. She had been photographed, profiled, analyzed, and celebrated with an intensity that would have overwhelmed someone far more experienced in managing public life. And through all of it, she had maintained something remarkable, a consistency. A sense that what you saw in each interview was a real person, not a performance, but also not the whole picture. She offered enough to satisfy. She held back enough to remain her own. That balance is extraordinarily difficult to maintain. It requires a kind of constant internal negotiation between what is genuine and what is strategic, between what you want to say and what you have decided it is wise to say. Celebrities who do it well make it look effortless. Lupita made it look effortless. But effortless is not the same as easy. Behind the composure, there were real pressures accumulating. The transition from award-winning actress to full Hollywood star brought with it a different set of demands. There were questions about what she would do next, whether she could sustain the momentum, whether the industry's embrace of her was genuine or simply the entertainment world's periodic need to anoint someone new and then move on. These were not paranoid concerns. They were reasonable ones, shared privately by people around her who understood how the machine worked. And then there was the particular pressure of being who she was, a black woman of Kenyan heritage, celebrated in an industry that had a long and complicated history with both of those things. The praise she received was real, but it was also loaded. Some of it carried the faint and uncomfortable weight of surprise, as though excellence from someone who looked like her required a different kind of acknowledgement than excellence from someone who fit the industry's older templates. She navigated that with grace too. Publicly. Always publicly. What she did not do, in any interview leading up to her appearance on Ellen's show, was let anyone see the seams. She did not complain. She did not express frustration. She did not let a single moment of weariness or irritation surface in any recorded conversation. Every interviewer who sat across from her got the same thing: warmth, intelligence, humor, and a very carefully maintained boundary around anything she had decided was private. Ellen DeGeneres had watched those interviews. Her producers had watched them. And somewhere in the preparation for that afternoon's taping, someone had identified the boundary. Not to respect it, to test it. That is the thing about live television that separates it from every other format. In a print interview, a subject can decline to answer and the journalist moves on, and by the time the piece is published, the refusal has been edited into something smooth. In a pre-recorded television segment, a producer can cut around an uncomfortable moment. But live television has no such mercy. Whatever happens in that room happens in real time, in front of however many people are watching, with no possibility of revision. Lupita Nyong'o walked into that studio prepared for the interview she had given 100 times before. What she got was something different. And the moment it began to shift, there was nowhere to go. The set of the Ellen DeGeneres show is designed to feel like the opposite of pressure. The colors are warm. The audience is close. The furniture is arranged to suggest a casual conversation between people who simply happen to be on television. Ellen typically enters dancing, the audience rises, and by the time the first guest sits down, the room has already been calibrated to a specific emotional frequency: light, generous, safe. That calibration is not accidental. It is the product of years of production refinement, and it works because it is genuine enough to be convincing even to people who know exactly what it is. Lupita Nyong'o walked out to that audience in early 2014, and the reception she received was immediate and sincere. These were people who had seen the film, who had read the profiles, who had watched the speeches. They were not a neutral crowd. They were already on her side. She sat down across from Ellen looking exactly as she always looked in these settings: composed, luminous, slightly amused by the scale of attention being directed at her. The early portion of the interview moved the way these things always move. Ellen asked about the film, about the awards, about what it felt like to hold the Oscar. Lupita answered with the same thoughtful precision she always brought to these questions. The audience responded warmly. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. And then Ellen shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It never is with Ellen. There was no change in her posture, no sharpening of her expression, no signal to the audience or to Lupita that the conversation was about to move somewhere different. That is the craft of it. The transition was seamless, a natural-sounding follow-up that grew out of what had just been said, the way a question sometimes appears to arise organically from the conversation when it has in fact been waiting in a specific place for the right moment to be deployed. Ellen brought up Lupita's now famous essay for Vanity Fair, a piece Lupita had written about beauty, about growing up and praying for lighter skin, about the specific pain of being a young girl who does not see herself reflected in the images the world holds up as desirable. It was a profound and personal piece of writing. It had moved an enormous number of people when it was published. It had also, in the way that profound and personal public statements sometimes do, created an opening. A place where the personal had been made available, and where a skilled interviewer could reach through it and find something that had not been offered. Ellen asked about the essay warmly. Lupita responded warmly. And then Ellen asked a follow-up question, and this was the question, about whether Lupita had ever personally felt, in her own real life, that her appearance had limited her. Whether there had been specific moments, specific experiences, where she had felt that the world was responding to how she looked in ways that were painful. Whether she could talk about what that actually felt like, not as a writer reflecting on childhood, but as a woman living in the present, in Hollywood, right now. The question landed in the room and something changed. It was small. It was the kind of thing you might not catch if you were not watching carefully. But the camera was watching carefully, and what it captured in the 2 or 3 seconds that followed was a very specific kind of recalibration happening behind Lupita Nyong'o's eyes. Not panic, not anger, something quieter and more controlled than either of those things. It was the look of someone who has been asked to step across a line they had decided, before walking into the room, they would not cross, and who is now calculating, in real time, how to respond without either crossing it or making the refusal look like a refusal. She smiled. That came first. The smile was genuine enough that a casual viewer would have read it simply as warmth. But it arrived a half-beat too late, and it held a fraction too long. And anyone who had watched enough of her interviews to know the rhythm of her expressions would have noticed that this particular smile was doing work. It was not a spontaneous expression. It was a considered one. She began to answer. She spoke carefully, choosing each word with the kind of deliberateness that sounds conversational, but is in fact the opposite of conversational. She acknowledged the essay. She spoke in general terms about the experience of growing up feeling that certain standards of beauty were not made with her in mind. She was eloquent. She was thoughtful. She gave Ellen something real. But she did not give her what Ellen had asked for. Ellen, to her credit or discredit depending on how you read it, did not let it go. She followed up. Gently, with a smile that matched Lupita's in its strategic warmth, she pressed again. She asked whether Lupita felt that now, in Hollywood specifically, as someone who was being celebrated in this industry, she ever felt that tension in a personal and present tense way. Not historically. Not as a child in Nairobi. Now, the room was very quiet. The audience, which had been a reliable source of warmth and laughter throughout the interview, had gone still in the way that audiences go still when they sense that what is happening in front of them is no longer entertainment. They were not uncomfortable enough to make noise. They were too interested to look away. They sat in that particular suspension that live television occasionally produces, the feeling of witnessing something that has not yet resolved into meaning, that is still in the process of becoming whatever it is going to be. Lupita looked at Ellen for a moment before she responded. It was a brief look. A second, perhaps slightly more. But it was direct, and it was assessing, and it contained within it the full weight of someone who understands exactly what is being asked of them and is deciding, in front of several million people, how much of the truth to give. She answered. She was gracious. She was measured. She said something genuine about the complexity of being celebrated by a system that has historically excluded people who look like her, and about holding both the gratitude and the awareness of that complexity at the same time. It was a real answer. It was also, unmistakably, a partial one. The door had been opened just wide enough to satisfy the immediate social pressure of the moment, and then, with extraordinary skill and almost no visible effort, it had been closed again. Ellen nodded. The audience responded with applause that was slightly more subdued than the applause that had greeted earlier moments in the interview. Not because they were disappointed, because they had felt something, and were not entirely sure what to do with it. The segment moved on. The cameras kept rolling. And Lupita Nyong'o sat with perfect composure in a room that was still recalibrating around what had just happened. The applause that followed was real, but it was different from the applause that had filled the room 20 minutes earlier. Earlier in the interview, the audience had clapped with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of people having a good time. This was something else. This was the sound of people responding to tension they had just watched resolve, or almost resolve, and the distinction mattered. There is a specific emotional texture to an audience that has been moved by something it did not expect, and that texture was present in that room in the minutes after Ellen's line of questioning came to its quiet, unfinished conclusion. Ellen moved the conversation forward the way experienced hosts always do, smoothly, without acknowledging the weight of what had just occurred, steering toward lighter territory with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for decades. A joke, a lighter question, the machinery of the show reasserting itself over the moment that had briefly interrupted it. And Lupita followed, because that is what you do. You follow the host. You accept the transition. You allow the room to return to its baseline, because the alternative, dwelling in the discomfort, naming what had just happened, is a kind of television that nobody in that studio was prepared to make that afternoon. But the room did not fully return to its baseline. Not really. There was a residue. The audience could feel it, even if they could not have articulated exactly what it was. The cameras captured it in the slight shift in the energy between the two women, still warm, still professionally cordial, but carrying something now that had not been there at the start. The invisible weight of a question that had been asked and only partially answered. Of a boundary that had been tested and had held, but had also, in holding, revealed itself. For Lupita Nyong'o, the immediate aftermath of that exchange was a study in professional discipline. She did not withdraw. She did not become clipped or visibly guarded. She continued to engage with Ellen and with the audience with what appeared to be genuine warmth. But those who were watching closely, and there were many, because this was a woman the entire entertainment industry was watching closely at that moment, could see that something had shifted in her posture. A slight drawing in. A fractional increase in the deliberateness of her responses. The kind of adjustment that a person makes when they have been reminded, in a very public setting, that not every room is as safe as it presents itself to be. When the segment ended and the show went to commercial, the studio began the slow process of resetting for the next segment. But the conversation about what had just happened was already beginning, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the particular way that significant live television moments begin to circulate. Someone in the audience mentioned it to someone next to them. A producer in the control room noted the moment in their log. And out in the world, where millions of people had been watching, the clip was already being isolated, rewound, and examined. By the following morning, the exchange had found its way onto entertainment news sites and social media platforms with a velocity that reflected how precisely it had struck a nerve. The coverage was not uniform. Some outlets framed it as a tense confrontation. Others described it as an awkward moment that had been gracefully handled. A smaller number looked at it more carefully and identified what it actually was: a live, unedited illustration of the particular pressure that Black women in public life face when the industry that is celebrating them simultaneously demands access to their interior lives as a condition of that celebration. That reading resonated. It resonated widely and with people who had no particular investment in either Ellen DeGeneres or Lupita Nyong'o as individual public figures, but who recognized in the exchange something they had experienced in their own lives in different forms. The expectation of openness. The subtle social penalty for maintaining privacy. The way warmth can be used as an instrument of pressure without ever losing its appearance of warmth. These were not abstract ideas. They were things people knew from the inside. And watching them play out in real time, on live television, between two extraordinarily skilled public figures, gave the moment a resonance that extended far beyond the entertainment world. For Ellen, the moment added a layer of complexity to a public image that was already, by 2014, beginning to attract more scrutiny than it once had. Her reputation as the safest, warmest presence in daytime television was real, but it was also, as this exchange illustrated, not the complete picture. There was a sharpness underneath the warmth, a willingness to press. And while that quality can be a virtue in certain kinds of interviewing, in this particular context, with this particular guest, it read differently. It read as an intrusion dressed as curiosity. Not everyone saw it that way, but enough people did that the moment became part of a longer conversation about what talk show hosts owe their guests, and what guests owe their audiences, and where the line between illuminating interview and extractive one actually sits. For Lupita Nyong'o, the long-term impact of the moment was more nuanced and ultimately more affirming than the discomfort of the exchange itself might have suggested. She had been tested in front of millions of people, and she had not broken. She had held her boundary with such skill and such grace that many viewers came away from the clip not with the sense that she had been exposed, but with a deepened respect for her capacity to navigate impossible situations without losing herself. The composure she had built her public image around had been subjected to a genuine stress test on live television, with no safety net, and it had held. But a foundation. She remained one of the most thoughtful and carefully self-possessed public figures in the entertainment industry. And she remained, notably, someone who continued to give interviews that were warm and generous and controlled. Someone who had learned, perhaps in part from moments like the one on Ellen's stage, exactly where her edges were and exactly how to protect them. The moment between Lupita Nyong'o and Ellen DeGeneres on that afternoon in 2014 was not a scandal. It was not a takedown. It was not the kind of live television catastrophe that ends careers or generates headlines for weeks. It was something quieter and more durable than any of those things. It was a glimpse, brief, unscripted, and entirely real, into the machinery that operates beneath the surface of celebrity. The machinery of expectation and access and the particular demands that public life makes on private people. And because it happened live, because there was no edit and no revision and no second take, it preserved something that most of what we see in the entertainment industry is specifically designed to prevent us from seeing. The truth of how hard it actually is. If this is the kind of storytelling that stays with you, the moments behind the moments, the live television that nobody was supposed to remember this clearly, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to Prime Talk, hit the like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who appreciates the story beneath the story. We will be here every time the camera catches something it was not supposed to.